questions or you want to... Yes, and this meeting is recorded. So for everyone to know, so also if you have to drop off this webinar early today, you can later on visit the ASPIS Academy website or the YouTube channel of, I don't know where specifically we're going to host this, Altertox or Ontox, but you can definitely rewatch this at a later point.
Yeah, I will share with the participants where they can find the webinar afterwards.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Marie. So during any point of this webinar training, if you have something to ask or thought to share, don't hesitate to just unmute yourself and let me know. Sometimes I miss if someone raises a hand. So if you are raising your hand and I don't react, just unmute yourself and talk to us. This reminds me very much of my university postdoc times where I did a bunch of teaching during the pandemic times where we always met online. And back then I came to also appreciate the setting because it is very connecting for like different people who are spread across the globe or across Europe to find some space and time to talk about topics that are interesting to us. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Marie, and the rest of the ASPIS Academy for having me. And let me talk about two topics that are very interesting to me, that always get me very motivated to speak about. And this is science for policy and science communication, specifically in the space of toxicology or ecotoxicology, because that's my background. Marie already introduced me. I'm Leonie. I have a PhD in ecotoxicology and I work at Altertox, and I'm also the communication coordinator for Precision Tox. Yeah, short introduction. This occurred to me at a certain point that I feel specifically in the transition time between academia and then Altertox, which is a private company. I feel like I have a bit of like two hats on, and I notice I use different profile pictures for the different settings. I am the policy officer, communication coordinator in my role now. So this is very like suited up, and I have this like very LinkedIn profile, but yeah, my background is in ecotoxicology. I'm very interested in ecology, everything nature protection as well. So this is my LinkedIn, not my LinkedIn, my ResearchGate profile picture is like just out in nature, hiking in an area that's also very near to my heart. I am currently the chair of the CTAC Risk and Communication Interest Group. CTAC, for those of you who come more from the toxicology side, CTAC is the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. It's the, I think, largest organization hosting everything ecotoxicology on the globe. There's different chapters. I'm most active in the European chapter of CTAC, and here I'm the chair of the Risk and Communication Interest Group. And I have been doing this role for, I think, a year and a half now. Before that, I was active as well. And this is also something, if you have questions about anything like career development, how I got involved and built my expertise in these more like soft skill topics that are important to our work, you can also ask me that anytime during the presentation or afterwards. I'm also a member of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution, IPCP. This is a very interesting group of researchers that formed this group to also do science to policy advocacy when it comes to regulation of chemicals. So this is something interesting to check out as well if you're interested in science to policy. My presentation, webinar training today is loosely based around like different parts of theory, more practice insights, and then finally, so the first two parts are on science to policy, and then the third point is more about science communication. And I do have some like designated sections of Q&A and discussions throughout. Because it is a quite broad journey we go through together today. So if there's like some questions that directly relate to what you have heard before, we have this designated little time slots where you can ask me questions. And first off, I want to start with a question to all of you. And if you could just, by raising your hand, indicate if you agree to this statement. So does toxicology research exist independently of policy development. With a show of hands, please indicate if you agree to this message. To have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, yes. So quite a few people would agree that toxicological research can be regarded as a separate entity from policy development. Very interesting. Thank you so much. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background to better understand science in policy and politics, and just to quickly explain the difference between policy and politics, at least in the English language. Policy refers more to the government side, so how countries are organized in regards to laws, regulation, and so on. So this is the policy. This is something that when scientists engage with this area are most likely to be in touch with. And politics, on the other side, is more what you think of like party politics, politics decision strategies, and so on. So these are just largely separated, what these two words mean. We don't have the separation in German, for example, but there's also Politik, but in English, policy and politics can be regarded as separate things. And we are talking about policy more today. And I want to generally give you some just theoretical background on how scientists can interact with these entities. And here I want to highlight an interesting read, which is The Honest Broker. This is already a couple of years old. I don't know if there's like a second or third edition out already. This is something that was written by Roger Pielke, a climate scientist. Interestingly enough, so he's not a like policy expert, but he does interact quite a lot with policymakers because climate research, of course, is a topic that is very relevant if you want to make science-based policy decisions. In this book, he describes 4 idealized roles that scientists can act through when interacting with policy and politics. And I just want to highlight right from the start that all of these roles are critically important and necessary for our modern day societies. And if you ever happen to pick up this book, so what I describe here today is like basically the main conclusion or main point that he tries to make over 300 although interestingly written pages. But when I read part of this, it sometimes felt quite exhaustive. But he pulls very interesting examples from recent and not so recent history where policy and science interacted to illustrate his points. And it is a quite interesting read, but at a certain point I was like, okay, I got it. So I just want to briefly summarize these 300 pages of this book by introducing these 4 idealized roles. So we have the pure scientist, the science arbiter, the issue advocate, and the honest broker. The pure scientist, I think, is what you have in mind. With you, I refer to the people that raised your hands when you said that toxicology, for example, as a science can exist independently of policy development. And here we have scientists that just focus on the basic science. They're not concerned with any political development, societal needs, or the application of the research that they conduct. So they're just focused on the basic science, and they're not concerned what happens to their research findings later on. And there is no interactions with policymakers or the wider societal like stakeholder groups. They're just focused on what they find scientifically relevant and interesting. The science arbiter already has some interactions and some considerations in their research questions when it comes to the application of their science or societal needs. So their research is influenced with what they see is interesting and necessary for societal development. They also sometimes interact with some policymakers. For example, if there's very specific policy questions that are posed to them, and they have the opportunity to participate in a formalized stakeholder advisory group, the science arbiter will then interact with policymakers. The issue advocate sees societal needs as the core driver of scientific developments. They see science as a resource in the process of science to policy. And when they work on policy questions, they will advocate for one specific policy option that is their preferred policy option that they think decisions should be based on. So they do not present multiple options. They say to a policymaker, this is the best option, and advocate for that option and use science as an argument for this policy option. So another word of issue advocate that we are more accustomed to would be lobbyists. So this is basically what lobbyists do. They select based on their values, based on who they work for. They choose certain policy options to advocate for. And then we have finally the name giver of the book, the honest broker of policy decisions. So this is also a scientist who is influenced or acknowledges societal needs, sees science as a resource, but compared to the the issue advocate, doesn't select a single policy option, but rather presents multiple options. Based on their scientific expertise, they can lay out, depending on what you choose, these would be the consequences of these choices, and then leave it to the policymakers based on their set of values, their considerations, to then choose one of these options. But they do not make this selection process for the policymakers. They will say, based on what I know, these are all of the options you have. This would be the consequences. Now you choose. All of these roles do exist in the real world, and all are relevant in their contribution to society. I'm happy to argue that also issue advocates are crucial for the development and improvement of our societies, but I'm also happy to hear your thoughts on that. Individuals can take on different roles in different situations as well. So you can act as an honest broker in one situation, then turn around and be an issue advocate for another question, or even the same. And you have to be aware that the perception of your argument will also differ depending how you present it. If you present it through the role of an honest broker, issue advocate, or science arbiter. And again, the source of these four idealized roles, and these are not, it's not you choose once, like when you finish your PhD, you have to make a decision, you stay a pure scientist throughout your career, or once you're an issue advocate, you always be an issue advocate. You can switch throughout these roles, and these are just for idealized roles to also be aware of how these mechanisms work, what people can, how people can act, how they can present their arguments. And this is something that doesn't only interest us here today, and we are not the only ones to think about this and discuss about this. I wanted to highlight an interesting series of letters that were published in 2019, and I think until early 2020. It started off by a letter by Thomas Backhaus. Thomas Backhaus, interestingly, is the professor that joined my old research institution in Germany just 2 months before I left. And he's a very interesting, outspoken scientist who also engages in the discussions about the theory and application of science to policy. And this is one example of that. And it was very interesting when I randomly came across it. So Backhaus argues that we cannot truly serve as honest brokers because we are all driven by our values. But there's a chance to work with that by acknowledging this. We move towards constructive conversations and more transparency. And he thinks in general it's a good thing to acknowledge that and be aware of that. This did not sit well with Mr. Callow, who also, I think, published a bunch of papers before all of this. I see someone raise their hand. Anik, did you want to?
Yes.
Yes, hi.
If I may ask a question, because
course.
I'm intrigued by the first, like the most left statement that because we have values, we cannot serve as honest brokers.
Yes.
Because I think having values doesn't mean that you have to be that you have to include them in your communication about science, right?
Yes. We don't, but we have to acknowledge, and I will touch on that a little bit further. And if this interests you, go have a look at all of these letters, because they go into these arguments in detail. And it was a fascinating read when I came across them. This is also why I want to highlight it here, because I think it can really help for all of us to reflect on the decisions that we make when we conduct research. And I think a lot of us do grow up with this expectation that we're all purely fact-driven. We follow the science, and we are not aware how our values, our societal background, how we grew up can influence the research question that we ask and so on. And so that's actually excellent that you raised that point. I agree. We are all driven by our values. This doesn't need to be inherently bad. It is just a reflection also of a diverse and democratic society. We have to have open conversations about how these values can influence our science and then also policy decisions. And I would agree that by acknowledging the point that Thomas Backhaus made, that we should all have an open discussion about this and acknowledge it, and then see that this leads to more constructive and more transparent discussions also about science that then ultimately lead into policy options. So thank you for Anik for highlighting that.
By the way, I thought it might be good to mention, I'm actually not a toxicologist myself. I did a master's in communication and innovation, and well, I basically followed a whole course on this subject, so that's why I'm super interested in this.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Marie, for the invitation.
I do agree, Anik, with you, and Thomas Backhaus would agree with you also. However, Mr. Callow did not agree with these statements. He would agree that we are all biased, and also there I will touch on this later a little bit. Having value-driven decision is not the same thing as bias. So there's also interesting research on that. There's another publication. Okay, I will try to. I could talk to you all about this for days. I have to move on because I have a lot of slides with super interesting stuff. So just to summarize this, Callow said scientific process must remain objective. When politics intrude, the science will fail, and this can result in devastating outcomes. In his paper, you can, as I said, you can have a look. They're all they're all just letters, so they're all 2 to 3 pages. It's a quick read. And he just referenced some devastating examples from the darkest times of human history, where science and policy intertwined in a very, as he said, devastating way. However, this is not what we usually do. Thomas Backhaus then continued to argue with him in 2019 and said the theoretical framework of science versus human and societal activity of science is not the same thing. Human and societal activity of science is and will always remain to be influenced by our values. And here, Marie, Anik, this is what I meant with value-driven decision-making. We even don't mention it. I don't know how many of you are aware of the acute Daphnia-Magna OECD toxicity test. This is a standard in our toxicology, ecotoxicology toolkit, more ecotox. It's a super important model organism. And he highlighted in his letter in 2019 that most of these studies are actually conducted with Daphnia-Magna. He shows some numbers. Under the OECD, it's also possible to use other organisms, but this is a very like Western society-focused organism that is not necessarily representative of other climate areas, so not necessarily representative of or protective of environments others than a very heavily like Western world, moderate climate area focus, if you get what I mean. And I never thought about that. So just growing up in the labs and the country that I didn't grow up in a lab, academically growing up in that lab. This is, for me, it's the standard organism, and I never questioned it. But this is a like societal, value-driven decision that I made without even knowing it. He also went on, and I don't want to get into this too far, but for example, the societal focus on certain topics, microplastics and glyphosate, because there's such a huge societal attention on these topics. A lot of research goes into these topics as well. So scientists do this research because they can get the funding. So this is a societal value, interest-driven research that doesn't necessarily represent the most urgent research questions. So this can also be considered a value-driven research. So I will not get into more detail on this series of letters, but some other folks got involved after Thomas Backhaus and Mr. Callow couldn't find an agreement on their arguments. A team around Gunlinda Öberg tuned in and also gave their perspective and tried to also like bring this together in like publications highlighting, acknowledging both sides. So they're very much the like bridge builders, and they concluded that science will always be, or the message science, the statement science will always be political is not the same thing as party politics or politics along a conservative, liberal, socialist scale influence research questions. This is not the same thing. They agree then that our research questions are driven by values, by policy, political, societal developments. They say it's impossible to conduct research in isolation from the surrounding society. For example, also, if we apply for funding, we usually somehow connect our research questions to societal needs, societal problems. So there we are already considering science and policy in our research questions. Our interests result from societal context and our training. We ask different questions at different times throughout like human history, but also our own individual lives. And for example, also the tolerance for uncertainty depends on our values and priorities. Researchers might come to different conclusions about specific topics, but this is not a problem per se, but a sign of healthy research. We need to acknowledge that each choice we make is informed by value judgments, and they also highlighted that the peer review at least is intended to take care of bias in research. An increase in increased transparency on this matter will help policymakers and the general public to understand how opposing scientific insights develop, because this is also something that can be quite detrimental to effective science to policy advice if we keep the conversations and also our disagreements on science or how values drive science just to ourselves in our community. We leave out the general public who needs to understand how this process works in order to accept scientific advice, scientific facts, and also to be able to accept that there are different scientific, different opinions on scientific questions. Who's this relevant for? This is just like a quick summary of who engages in science to policy. These are NGOs, trade association, but also research consortia and industry. And then this can be groups or individuals depending on also the policy questions, it can look very different than who will be engaging as a stakeholder with policymakers. So now I want to do a little question again to you. So coming back to this statement, does toxicology research exist independently of policy and development? How many of you would still say no? Like I would say how I conduct research is strictly separate from society and policy developments. By a show of hands. Barbara? Brigitte?
Can I have a question?
Yes.
So, hello.
Hi.
Related to this question, I think, or the way that I understand it, is actually not does toxicology research exist only independently of policy development, but in addition to policy development. I don't think it's yes or no. I don't think it's that simple.
Yes, I would agree. I think it depends on individual roles and individual understanding. And that is what I want to also highlight in this presentation, that you as scientists, you can take on many different roles and hats. And it is possible to remove yourself as far as possible from the consideration of societal needs. It also depends very much on like which area of research you're in. But toxicology, and I originally gave this presentation in front of early stage researchers from ecotoxicology. And our research from this field is very directly related then in the end to policy decisions. If we investigate the toxicity of a chemical, it is very likely that this information will somehow feed into the decision if this chemical needs to be regulated or not. Or we find a new mode of action, or we find that even if we're like more, we don't even consider specific chemicals in our research, but we investigate environmental toxins and how they can mess with the endocrine system of fish, and we can show that this is actually an issue, then there's a high chance this will be picked up by the general society and policymakers, and then will lead to changes in regulation, as we just saw for the CLP regulation, where endocrine disruptors are now considered as a hazard class. However, you can still say, I do not care. I simply care about the mechanism in how environmental toxins can interfere with the endocrine system of fish. Fair enough. All of these rules, these roles that are highlighted in this book, The Honest Broker, I mean that they do exist and they are all valid.
Okay, thank you.
This answer, I'm sorry, I can ramble on about these topics for days. I'm not lying about that. But okay. You can also like, if I don't manage to answer like any questions, or like just like ask me again, because I lose track sometimes. Okay, good. Moving on. Now I don't see, I changed something here in my thing. Now I cannot see any like little pictures of if anyone's raising their hand. Okay, so I just wanted to like open this up now for a bit of more of a Q&A and discussion. And I just put some questions here that might be interesting for you. So have you been involved in the translation of science to policy? I would be super interested to hear about your experience. Who do you expect to become a policy advisor? What is the impact of science advocacy in the democratic process? So this lobbyist activity that we usually think about or hear about when we hear science to policy. And why did you choose to become a toxicologist, ecotoxicologist? And does it somehow relate to this question of science to policy? Now I can see people again.
All right. Does anyone want to get started on one of the questions? Yes, maybe good to have them up. Thanks.
Yeah, since I've been talking anyways, just a
Yes.
few seconds ago, I'm happy to start. I think I have maybe occupied a few different roles in this. I have started, I have a background in general biology that did my PhD in environmental health sciences, focusing on in vitro toxicology at Altertox in the Czech Republic. Then went for a postdoc for 3 years to work with the Goliath project in the Urian cluster on metabolic disruption, serving as the project manager for pre-validation of in vitro test methods. There's a clear overlap into policy. And now I'm working as a technical expert with Syngenta as an agrochemical company, basically performing or managing tests according to regulatory guidelines.
Yes, and throughout your education and career so far, have you been or have you seen directly how like science to policy, science advocacy can influence democratic decision processes?
Yeah, the first very eye-opening instance was in 2017 when I had a chance to join an EFSA VKM. I think that was the Norwegian Food Safety Authority joint workshop on genetic modified or on genetic modification, genetically modified organisms, which from my general biological studies, I thought that it's like fairly understood, but the workshop with people who actually make the policy was eye-opening in the sense that the biological or like mechanistic understanding in the regulators is not always what as scientists we might assume. So that was basically a whole workshop organized around science advocacy. I'm not sure that it actually changed anything, but it showed the discrepancy of what we think in the scientific community and what is like political regulatory practice. Yeah, and then I guess I did my PhD and my postdoc, especially in a time where we are seeing a shift in the in vitro methods of in vitro test methods currently in the test guidelines still being used mainly for like hazard identification and prioritization for further animal testing. And we are now at a point where we have a where we may see a paradigm shift, or in this like yeah, a change and a drive more towards non-animal methods. I think the consultation period for the European Commission roadmap just finished earlier this week. So now the regulatory environment changes from we have these in vitro tests that are often fairly simple, giving a yes/no answer, but how do we use the information from that for more quantitative assessments to decide like, okay, we have something, can we make a more definitive answer when we, for example, rank chemicals with respect to their risk, not only their hazard. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, very timely topics that you've been involved in.
Yeah.
And maybe I wanted to add my perspective on this EFSA workshop that you described, and you're surprised that the level of expertise isn't shared among all stakeholders. And this is something that I often experience as well. We as scientists talking to each other most of the time. If we talk about our subjects, the person we talk to has roughly the same level of technical background understanding. And we assume that this is the same when we engage with people in the science to policy arena. And I think it's easier for us to acknowledge that people who sit, for example, in the European Parliament are not all toxicologists and ecotoxicologists, so that we do have to provide a substantial amount of like base knowledge in order to have an at least somewhat eye-to-eye conversation about certain things, including risk and so on. But also if we talk to policymakers, like the technical policymakers, so for example, people from Commission, the regulators that work for the European Union agencies like EFSA and ECHA and the Medicine Agency, there are also discrepancies, and we are, and I say we, I mean you're the researchers investigating these questions. So you are at the like at the tip of the new knowledge. There's no one who's more expert in this as you are. And people who work outside of research consortia can try to stay up to date, but no one will ever know as much about this as you are doing the actual research. And this is something we always need to consider. When we talk about stakeholders, we have to be very aware about their technical background when we engage in conversations with them. And I have like the third part of this webinar today is about science communication, where also we'll touch on these topics a bit more. But yeah, thanks for sharing, Barbara. Annick.
Yes, I was thinking, because the knowledge, of course, like these policymakers are never going to have the same knowledge that you do. That's simply not realistic. I mean, you did a like bachelor, master, and PhD in it. So yeah, that's probably not a realistic expectation. But I think also they are mainly making their decisions based on, well, on the one side, I think your expert opinion, but on the other side, like the values, right? The societal values and the political, interests. So I think that is their expertise, and I think it's important to make explicit what the influence is. Well, based on these subjects, like, I just gave a presentation to my own toxicology group here in Utrecht University a few weeks ago, and we had a whole discussion. Like, actually, everything related to toxicology and policy, it's super political, because if you like set a safe value, that is so not neutral. Like, what is a safe value? That is already such a political decision. And I think like the implications of that is, I think, what the policy officers are about, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I think I really like that you raised this point, because this is something we all have to acknowledge, consider, and to a certain degree accept when we engage in science to policy advice. We are, in most cases, we're engaging in this field as technical experts and to give advice, to give background and help the decision makers understand the consequences of different policy options. We are not there to dictate the decisions that will lead to a technocracy, and this is not something that is then very well representative of the societal needs. We have to accept that we can bring a certain level of expertise that then leads to an advice, but then we hand this to the democratic process, and it is to a certain degree out of our hands. At least this is how I understand the work I'm doing. I don't feel that I am equipped to dictate policy decisions that are made on based on the scientific advice that I can give, because I cannot consider all of the scientific societal needs, how this like, even if I as a single entity could serve as an honest broker and define all of the different policy options and all of the potential then societal effects that this has, I cannot really like do all of this. It is a lot of work. And I would not feel comfortable even if I do have all of these options to then say, okay, this is the decision. This is in the hands of the democratically elected officials that have a better consideration of societal needs, or this is just the, what's the system we agreed to do, you know? Democracy is our best chance of having a good representation of what the best outcome for the largest part of the group of people actually is. And this is my understanding. There are different understandings out there as well. This is also part of democracy, but this is how I would consider this. And this is something that we all need to be aware of also if we engage this process. We're not there to dictate the decisions. We can help make informed decisions, but then at a certain point, it is out of our hands.
Yeah, like the way I explained it to my colleagues in the presentation was like policy is basically science plus values. So yeah, and then I think as a scientist, it's important that like the science is as neutral as possible, which is of course also always a challenge, which doesn't mean that you cannot have values and that you cannot communicate about them, but it's important that the science, I think, is perceived as neutral inherently.
Yes. Agreed. Like to the extent that we're possible to remove our values, because we're also people doing the violence. We're not AI, we're not machine. Even AI is not, you know, we're not. Yeah. And we have to acknowledge that in a transparent way as well, and try to remove our values, definitely bias as far as possible from research. And there are many mechanisms aimed at doing that. And then it is a matter of educating yourself and just being aware of that and including this in science communication, communication about policy and so on. And I think that's like what will drive us into the right direction of having good science to policy mechanisms, like a healthy, democratic science to policy environment. Okay, does anyone else wanted to join the discussion around this part or has a question at this point? If not, I will move on to the second part where I will just highlight a little bit how this translates into the real world. And this is, of course, informed by my very personal experience and perspective, and just give some highlights on how science to policy can look like in the day-to-day. And I somehow did something weird with the like Zoom thing. I have to see, because this is not presentation mode, right? It's now. Okay. Good. So are we the first people to think about this, talk about this, consider working in science to policy? Of course, we are not. So I do want to highlight a little bit resources that can help you also like try to find your role in this and then to educate yourself to feel comfortable if you encounter this like science to policy interface that is to a certain degree part of our academic or our researchers' life as well. So I want to highlight one publication that's very interesting to check out. It's done by the Joint Research Center. It is a summary of their knowledge management for policy initiative that was intended to inform the work of the EU Commission staff. But the JRC found this is like so interesting and helpful. Let's give this out to the world, to the general public of researchers in different fields to educate themselves and build their skills around science to policy. And the main take home, I don't want to go through all of these like in detail, but these are the like core skills the JRC has identified are helpful in effective science to policy work. The main message here is they say if you do want to do science to policy, you cannot expect to be an expert or have skills across all of these different sets. They rather say if you are an entity like a research consortium, NGO, whoever engages in this field, it is good to have a team that covers all of these like key skills that help to do science to policy effectively. So this is just something, if you're interested, also if you're interested to build your skills, this is a good point to start to even, like, figure out which skills do I even need. One of the skills is understanding policy. I cannot see my own understanding policy making to know when and how to present evidence. Yes, this is very important. And this is something also not like super easy to figure it out by yourself, because one thing I can share from personal experience, like we working in the European Union, the relevant laws that are made when it comes to chemicals, toxicology, ecotoxicology, are EU laws that are then implemented through the national agencies. But if you want to like influence the like high impact big stuff, it will be EU laws. And this is just how the different EU institutions are build, work, how a policy file moves through the different entities that we have. So the European Commission, Parliament, Council. It can be a quite complex thing to understand when you look at it. I know I learned this stuff in high school, probably at a certain point. Forgot pretty much all of it when I started my work in Brussels. There are, however, also here some interesting or good resources. There's this book, the European Parliament, that was handed to me by my boss at Altertox when I started working. He said, like, every rule on how things are done in the Parliament, how things move, when, where, what, everything's in there. So this is basically the manual to the European Parliament. If you're interested to follow, for example, the development of the revision of certain files, you can look at this. It's by the European Commission, or it's by the Parliament, Legislative Train Schedule. I really like this, but I really like trains, so I am a bit biased in that regard. But they basically translated how files move like through the different agencies, timelines and so on, into like a train schedule, and actually have like little trains. It's darling. I like it very much. So this is something interesting to check out if you're like, I'm interested, like where's REACH at, or the cosmetics regulation revision. Then this is a web page that you can check for information. There are also other resources for information, science to policy advice. This is the Science Advice for Policy by European academies. I have been only informed by them, like, so I participated in one of their conferences, I think back in 2021, so already a while ago, where they had a conference, Science Advice Under Pressure. This was in the midst or towards the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they had a 2-day conference focusing on the, I think it was mainly like the differences between how science advice works in the climate crisis versus the COVID-19 pandemic, because they're like very, they're similar in the sense that they are globally impactful, these crises, and they have the potential to impact the day-to-day of everyone. They should be like in the interest of everyone, but they're characterized by quite differently, comes to their time dimension, the readiness of science, and also the public perception of the science. So this is something, it was just very interesting. So if you want to check that out, I think the presentations, so the panel presentations, all of it is on their website. You can find it somewhere. So this was like super, super interesting. Now finally, like a bit more the day-to-day of science to policy, how it looks like for me. So I am mostly involved to science to policy through my position as policy officer at Altertox. And there, for example, we are involved a little bit with the REACH revision. For those of you who are not toxicologists, ecotoxicologists, REACH is the, I think, largest piece of legislation worldwide that manages the safe use of industrial chemicals. It is, or it has been opened for revision, so to improve potentially. That's always what we want to, like, if we open it, we should improve it. But what that actually means, like for different stakeholders, it is very different. But the origin why REACH is under revision, it's this law is already quite old. I think it was implemented in 2007, and the science has since then developed quite a bit. And also all of the people who are somehow affected and work with REACH did have quite some notes on how to potentially also make it easier, but also more protective. Industry had some comments on this, like with their set of like intended ways to improve it. I like don't want to like put any value on any of this, but so there were some comments. Science has evolved, and now with the Green Deal and Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, which was put on the table by the last term's commission, so the first term of Ursula von der Leyen. They developed this Green Deal, and under this Green Deal, a lot of the regulation of laws concerning with chemicals have been opened up. And we have seen like some expected changes on how the text was adapted, like by the European Commission. Polymers should be considered, more information on the endocrine disruptors, also effects on nervous and the immune system, and more information for low tonnage substances, also more information on PMT and so on. So there were a lot of changes added to the REACH regulation intended to protect the environmental and human safety better. How this is now influenced not only by the scientific expertise held within the European Commission, but also by the external experts. There were high-level roundtable, like expert stakeholder group conversations, bringing together representatives from government, intergovernmental organizations, industry, and civil society, with the mission to monitor the implementation and also highlight the dialogue with the stakeholders concerned to feed in their opinions, feedback, expertise also in this process. The current status of the revision, it has been delayed and then kind of stopped. I think you all probably realize we recently had the elections for the term 10 of the European Parliament. And after the election, everything just takes a little bit time to settle until also the like Commission's intended like focus of the next term is defined. We do, like from what we hear in Brussels, is that the REACH revision is not like fully stopped, will be actually picked up by like the next Commission again. And we do hear some rumors, whispers here and there that the REACH revision will be submitted to the European Parliament for 2026. So because there was a bit of a fear that this file was completely, or the revision was completely killed under the pressure of certain stakeholders who didn't agree with the development, but also other like political, and it's all super complicated. But here I just also wanted to highlight for those of you that might know, we're more from the Ecotox background. So part of the high-level roundtable experts was also a member or a representative of the CTAC, so the Society for Environmental Toxicologists and Chemists. Just to highlight a little bit through which entities it is also possible to inform policy making. REACH revision from my perspective. So what we do at Altertox, we of course support research consortia that we are involved in. So this is through ASPIS, mainly on tox and precision tox. We help with communicating like their expertise to the relevant European entities. We also produce briefs ourselves. We help organize conferences that informs different stakeholders, brings them together. And we also organize seminars and meetings to increase the scientific literacy of policymakers in different agencies. This was mentioned earlier by Barbara. I think you said that you were surprised at EFSA that the level of expertise differs quite a bit. So this is something that we try to help with, that we can bridge these knowledge gaps or fill these knowledge gaps a little bit to help policymakers also identify relevant topics and have like informed voices then in the political discussions. Science to policy through ASPIS. This was also mentioned. I don't know who mentioned it just now. Anik, if that was you, I can't remember, but yes, we currently have the EU Commission roadmap. That is an ongoing project intended to be finalized, I think, next year or the year after. This happens, so this is just for you that haven't heard of this before. So the EU Commission develops currently a roadmap for phasing out animal testing in chemical safety assessment. So this is just a general roadmap describing this is where the science needs to go, this is where we need to go, defining milestones. This needs to happen to ultimately phase out animal testing. This doesn't mean that there's a like defined date where Commission says, okay, until then we will have abolished all animal testing, but they do commit to defining a roadmap that can also influence research activities, policymaking, and so on, to generally lead us on this road towards phasing out animal testing. So it's a bit, to state the commitment of the Commission and to also help organize stakeholders to like point in the same direction. This is how I would describe it, or how I see what's happening there. And this is happening because we did have a European Citizens Initiative, Safe Cruelty-Free Cosmetics, Commit to a Europe Without Animal Testing, specifically aimed at the overlap between the cosmetics regulation and REACH. For those of you who don't know, there are certain circumstances. So cosmetics cannot be tested on animals since 2006, I think, 2006, in the European, no, 13, whatever, a while ago. We committed in the European Union that it is not necessarily anymore to test cosmetics ingredients or cosmetic products on animals. So it's not allowed anymore. However, if there is an overlap to REACH, and this is happens sometimes when there's ingredients in cosmetics that are handled by workers, and then it becomes a worker safety issue, which is then handled under REACH, and there it is requested to do animal testing to determine like safety levels for workers that handle these chemicals. And then you end up with cosmetics that have still been tested on animals, which is something no one wants. So there was this European Citizen Initiative calling on the European Commission to please look at this and find a way how to solve this. And the European Commission, this is the great thing about democratic processes in the European Union, if you are able to successfully finalize like one of these European initiatives, you need to have like a certain amount of signatures then by the general public. And if you have that and hand it in, European Commission has to look at it. Fascinating process of our like democratic European Union. So what they did then, they committed to develop a roadmap to phase out animal testing. And where we now come in with our expertise from ASPIS, so far there's been one workshop in 2023 with Laura Holden, who works in the Precision Tox project on identifying barriers to the uptake of new approach methodology, so non-animal testing methods under chemical regulation. Now working on the like second part of this research, which is developing policy solution. And this is something that the European Commission is very interested to receive this scientific feedback out of our consortium. So her research was highlighted during the initial workshop in 2023. The second workshop will take place actually next week in Brussels, and joined to this meeting. There is a workshop on the evening before, the commission workshop that has been driven by the Risk Hunter project, so the third project under ASPIS, where they will present the ASPA to make next generation risk assessment happen, where they want to inform the commission, again, increasing the expert level and literacy of decision makers to very specific research that we're concerned with, and they bring this to the stakeholders who are involved in these workshops of the EU Commission for the roadmap. Also, this was mentioned, the EU Commission also calls often to for stakeholders to inform their work through what they call for evidence. They have like a very specific process. If there is new like roadmaps, legislation introduced to the European Union, they open this for feedback. They call this a call for evidence. It has been closed on the 15th, and there is a lot of input that the stakeholders that are involved or that are concerned with this roadmap, a lot of them submitted their expert feedback. It is super interesting to read. Didn't have a chance to look at all of them because I think they ended up with 91 expert feedback contributions in the end. And Precision Talks also, so we as Precision Talks also submitted our expertise on like certain points, what we think should be considered. And here the nice thing is now we submitted it, now Commission has to look at it. That's the beauty of it, because also a lot of this work, sometimes science to policy, it can be a bit intransparent. Who talks to whom at what point? When do I have a chance to give my expertise? Where do I meet the people? So it is very, very important to also be aware of these like public calls for information to then feed in your expertise. And then if it's on paper, then Commission has to at least look at it. Something we also did with Precision Talks, for example, we hosted we organized a small event at the European Parliament to again inform policymakers, the people responsible for the like democratic process of improving law, to make scientifically literate decisions, to inform them about what expertise we have to offer and the latest developments out of these projects. So this is something we also did in 2023. And now I want to open this part again to a little bit of a Q&A. And I know we discussed this a little bit earlier, but this is a quote that my boss basically greeted me with to the new job, which is when nobody is happy, it's a good compromise, as a saying in Brussels. And maybe I just want to hear your thoughts about that statement, but I'm also happy to take any questions that you might have. It is, of course, also fine if there are no questions at this point, because we did have quite a good discussion earlier on, and we can just continue to the final part of the presentation, which is then now more focused a bit on science communication and the importance of those skill sets for ecotoxicologists. Good. Okay. So 21st century toxicology is a scientific field that is continuously getting more and more complex. The methods that we use and the corresponding data that we receive is a complex thing. I did some omics stuff during my master's thesis, I think, and I don't think this can even be considered big data. However, I handled large data sets, put them into like ontology tools to then produce these like very complicated gene function, how to communicate complex scientific findings to different stakeholders that are driven by different questions that have different levels of expertise. How do we need to adapt as individuals, but also as institutions, to account for the fact that the science we produce gets increasingly complicated? Because at the same time, we do have a society with an increasing demand for knowledge throughout like global crisis in the day-to-day to react to an ever-changing world. There is a huge demand for knowledge. How can we ensure that the data we produce and the conclusions that we draw are heard and also understood by our stakeholders? And how can science communication look like in a rapidly developing world? So I want to highlight a little bit like some key aspects that should be part of our SciComm toolbox. And this is customized communication. So define the purpose. What do you want your stakeholders to understand? This is something we often fail to do. We are interested in everything. We are even interested in the methodology part, why we choose certain machines. The general public is not interested by these detailed questions. So it is important to when we start to communicate, to define what do you want your stakeholders to understand, and is there something you want your stakeholders to do? Are there like very clear messages that you need to include in your communication? I cannot go. Can I go back? Yes. Build your message in a compelling way. Why should the audience care? Are there ways to relate to different current events? Some like day-to-day activities, our value to the people. How can I make them care about the message that I have? Address your audience needs through storytelling in an engaging way to make them at least initially interested in what you have to say. To this, so I have a hard time operating my computer today. Okay, choose the right tools to disseminate your message. And here, for example, it's important to understand your stakeholders very well, and then to identify where are my stakeholders. Is LinkedIn the best way to communicate something I want to communicate to the general public? Or is it better to use Facebook or TikTok if I want to address really young people, and so on? So this should then also be considered when you craft your message, choose the platform. A very how do I say this? A very like hands-on advice if you craft your science content. And this is something I took from my wonderful colleague, Monica, who has a degree in science communication and whose expertise on this subject I admire greatly. And she had this like also very practical advice I'd want to give you because potentially as like early stage researchers, you also engage often in science communication. So this is some hands-on help to do that. So if you have an idea, just jot down your notes, quick and dirty, structure it to sections and a roadmap. Draft your raw material, write quickly and badly. And then you go in and edit your content, take into consideration all of the like initial planning, analysis, like messaging you have in mind, and repeat the process until there is nothing left to improve. And this also helped me greatly because what holds me back sometimes also in crafting messages is this idea that when we put our like pen down or we start typing, everything that comes out of us like should be like ready to print material. Specifically with like science communication, there needs to be an editing process that helps you to like really craft a message that does what you want to do. So I think this is like a very nice like hands-on. Know your audience. Touched on that before. So you to relay your message, it is really good to have tailored content. So there are ways to really analyze your target audience. You can, if it's like a very, for example, at the beginning of a project, it could be a step to then conduct surveys, interviews, focus group to like really understand your audience better. You could also look for information like industry reports and data on your target demographic, look for patterns and commonalities in the data you've collected, and segment your target audience into subgroup based on shared characteristic to really have the possibility to tailor your content. Storytelling, stories have always engaged people. If you have a clear narrative and weave consistent story thread across touch points, you have a very coherent, unified and captivating messaging that is supported by harmonized visual aesthetics, message and elements. It is more likely that the message you send out is actually perceived by the stakeholders. So by now, when we, for example, talk about research consortia, there are some must-haves. This is a website newsletter that can be like digital and printed. There are different social media platforms that you can consider. But here it's very important again to identify where are the stakeholders that you want to reach. Are you mainly communicating to professionals and also have some possibility for like interactivity about your research? Then LinkedIn is a good choice. But if you mainly want to target like the general public and the very young portion of although I'm also on TikTok, so it's not only like super young people there. However, like predominantly it's the younger community, and then like you choose the platform accordingly. However, you have to consider, you have to then like reshape the maybe the messaging and also the optics, the visuals of your the posts that you create to fit onto those platforms, because there are different visuals that work well on Instagram versus Facebook, and also for TikTok there are like certain rules to follow when producing the content in order for it to actually like work and like get some traction on these platforms. For LinkedIn, it is important to, if you are, for example, communicating for a research consortium, like I do for Precision Tox, is to find your own voice, tone, style, but also to inject personality here and there while maintaining the scientific accuracy. And here for me, it's also very important to be consistent, to have a consistent and professional tone on this platform that then, but also connects to like the stakeholder groups that are important specifically for this research project, and this is also policymakers, regulators. We have some add-ons when it comes to audiovisual tools. So for example, we can do podcasts, webinars, vlogs, and interviews. If you do have someone in your team with some like technical literacy for these different tools, and this becomes more and more accessible nowadays as well, then it's very easy to set these up as well. And this is a great way to engage with different stakeholder groups. Written communication is a good way to also reach into pockets of stakeholders you usually do not reach. Like, for example, if you just highlight news on your website or LinkedIn. For example, the information event we held at the European Parliament was then highlighted in a news article written by one of our Altertox colleagues and published in a online news outlet that is very like specific and targeted at EU policy interested people. When you do science communication, it is like helpful to look at some like key performance indicators and to define them. You need to set up some different analytical tools, for example, to send out the newsletters. It would be interesting then to know, do they actually like reach the email addresses? Do people open them? Do they click on the links? MailChimp lets you do this. Google Analytics, never used it in the past, had to look at it for Precision Talks, for Precision Talks website. Blew my mind. There's so many like different options then to as well like look at just parameters that tell you if your website works, if people find the information they are looking for, what's most interesting, and then based on that you can then also like restructure the website, focus differently. Super interesting. So there's like so many like different parameters on there. I really want to dig at it at a certain point to see how to also like make the most of the communication that we do. LinkedIn Business also allows you to just collect some data, also on your stakeholders, to then analyze, well, are the people that follow us, do we have the stakeholders in our following that we want to have there? Do we need to do campaigns to get like certain people involved and are interested in the project and so on? So why this matters, we don't communicate on LinkedIn to collect likes and hearts. We do not communicate just to communicate, but with a purpose. And what I try now to look at is to link the KPIs across our different platforms to track our communication dissemination success. So for example, we had one report, a deliverable coming out of Precision Talks that is very relevant to our stakeholder community of policymakers. This was also the topic of the event at the European Parliament. So of course we feature the report on the website. We translated this into a policy brief. Policy brief is just like a super short summary with action points that is like very easy to like explain complex reports and stuff, but it's just like the basics. This is what I want to take policymakers away from it. And we featured this on the Precision Talks website and LinkedIn. And then I did, I think, a post on the LinkedIn to highlight it. And I saw there was a lot of engagement on the LinkedIn, but then I don't know, do people actually read the policy brief or even the report? And I could then track like through our KPIs across these platforms that actually, yes, people saw it at LinkedIn, then I saw a spike and people actually went to the website, they found the report and they looked at it. So this is then for me a good way to track if the communication that I do actually reaches the people. Now I want to highlight just a little bit some tools, strategies to make your life a little bit easier when it comes to communications, communication strategies, and this communication plans. This is something we use when we have certain events coming up, like larger events. We know we produce quite a bit of material, just to have like a bit of an overview. What are we going to produce? So is there, what is the audience that we want to engage with? What are the stakeholders? What's the message we are sending out? Then choose based on that, like what's the best delivery method, like the platform to post this. And we can also manage the scheduling, who's responsible and tasked to actually achieve this. Then we have, I see there is something in the chat. I'm just seeing if this is, okay. Bye, Barbara. I also being mindful of the time. So there's also a way of like higher level, like strategize your messages. And this is something I created for Precision Talks. I termed it the vision report. So this is just like the overall vision, what we see the project being able to deliver, what are the main messages, how do they relate to the research that's coming out, and what do we need to communicate when to get the stakeholders engaged that we want to stay informed. So this is also just a tool to like structurize your communication for it to actually be impactful. Because I do not like to communicate and it just feels like I'm shouting into a void. I want the communication to be impactful and meaningful. So in conclusion, how to ensure that your communication is not just an afterthought is to implement and develop communication strategies based on like also the body of knowledge that's already out there, but also to develop your own tools and strategies to make sure your communication does what it's intended to do. Also rely on expertise. It's crucial to develop the message and create effective, that's weird, ignore that. It's important to get experts involved. I'm an expert in ecotoxicology. I'm not an expert in science communication. So I really need to dig into those like expert pools and get the information I need to communicate effectively. Select a good toolbox depending on which stakeholders you want to reach. And it's very important to also do like a good cooperation, technical experts and science communication experts coming together to really deliver good communication. Just some take homes on the like earlier parts on science for policy. And this is a bit out of context now, but I just wanted to let you know, like, because it can be a bit like science to policy can be a bit much, I guess. But I hope that today's webinar like empowers you to be curious and build your skills around this topic. Be mindful of the roles you choose, so make like educated decisions on how you can engage in this field. To be aware of the possibilities and resources already out there to develop your skills, and to be confident in your informed decisions and look for opportunities if you're interested to do science for policy. And with this, I close, and we have a little bit of time for some questions or discussions surrounding these topics. But first of all, thank you for joining us. Again, thank you for listening. And yeah, let me know if you have a question.
I'm just taking over because Mari is sitting in a very noisy room, and I would just like to thank you on behalf of the ASPIS Academy, to everybody for attending the webinar, but especially to Leonie for this fantastic talk, and especially for this very specific topic that I think early care researchers usually don't come across. So I think this kind of information is super interesting for us and very relevant as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Good. You can also, like, if you don't feel like asking a question now, you can also like follow up with me via email. I'll just put my email in the chat. And I also wanted to put the link to the this roadmap call for evidence in the chat. Like, if any of you is interested to check out like who submitted their expertise there and how it looks like, and just the argument. I of course I find it fascinating, but maybe it's also for you interesting to have a look.
We'll also share the webinar once we have the recording and everything with all the attendants.
Yes.
Okay. So I think there is no final question, it seems. So I think we can close the webinar. Also, one last thought. Oh, perfect. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to ask, in terms of when you approach policymakers for whatever policy idea or whatever the issue that you want to put to the table, how do you come to that point to say this aspect need policy changing, or how do you identify the areas that needs to be advocated for?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you compare that with to say that for the past whatever years this has been happening, but then I think this is the new approach that must be looked at. How do you come to those decisions? Thanks.
Yeah. Excellent question. And there are probably many different answers to that, but I can describe how it looks like for Altertox specifically. We are a company that's focused on our mission and vision is to make alternative testing a reality. So this is what drives our interest. And then for us, it is often that we don't identify the questions ourselves, but because my boss already has a very good network in the European Parliament, they come to us with the questions. So they, for example, there's a new political advisor for the Greens that now comes into like a specific position, and they know, I'm going to deal with the REACH revision in a year. So they will have some like questions regarding that to just make sure they're up to date with the information. So they approach us, we're like, hey, what do you expect the revision, how it will affect the numbers required, like animal testing numbers required, how will it increase, decrease, and where do you see possibilities to implement NAMs? I advised on a teeny tiny policy revision file last year on the detergents regulation, and there we were approached by the office of the European Parliament member that was responsible for this file, and there was a very specific test for a very specific product required, and the only thing they knew was like our values tell us I do not want to do the animal test. So they just gave it to us and said, do we need to do the animal test? And then we looked at the literature, guidances, and so on, and just presented them with what we found for them to then like change the text accordingly and defend their position. What I see also in like academic researchers, there's sometimes if professors do have like an appetite for policy, and not everyone does, fair enough. But if they do, they will then serve as experts on their if a policy question is in the core of their scientific expertise, they will be approached by like certain advocates, for example, who then want to like feed their expertise to the relevant people. So the question like very much is defined by what the policymakers in the day-to-day are like focusing on now. I know that larger organizations that do employ more people can also be a bit more like proactive. They're able to scan what's on the horizon and like define what the questions are. But for us, it's more of a like react to what is presented to us and then present our expertise on it. Thanks for the question. Yeah, good one.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you everybody again. Now it seems that we will close the webinar. Thank you again, Leonie. Thank you, Mari, for organizing this. And final tip, if you want to know about future ASPIS Academy webinars, the ideal way is to subscribe to our LinkedIn group or to join our LinkedIn group where we post all our news. Okay, thank you, everybody, and see you next time.